Let's change gears now and talk about the fantastical world of theatre. William Kentridge's large-scale production, The Head and the Load, is coming to South Africa. In fact, it's arrived. This stellar production will be staged at the Joburg Theatre from the 21st of April, yes, that's next week, to the 6th of May. And the play tells the story of Africa's role in the First World War. It illuminates the untold story of the millions of black African porters and carriers and more who served during that Great War, as it was called. Without giving away too many details, we're joined by actor, a vocalist, collaborator, Nhlanhla Mahlangu, who joins us here in studio on this Friday evening. A week out from hitting the boards, we do thank you for your time this evening, Nhlanhla. Just reading that intro and again looking at what the subject matter is for The Head of the Load, you cannot help but get goosebumps. Because from what I understand, the narrative around the role of African people in that war was very much the colonial power saying, look, we recognize the role that you played, but it mustn't be recorded. It mustn't be put on a pedestal. What for you was important about the story to tell in this way?
What's important for us to tell the story is actually to tell the people who built the city of Johannesburg with their bare hands, to tell the soldiers who died in vain and never got recorded. And we, as you know, Head and the Load has been performed in Europe, and it's for the first time it's coming to Africa, and it gives an opportunity for Africa to speak back to Europe, that where are our medals? Where is our recognition? Our deeds are not recorded. We are here to reclaim our history. We are here to take our space that we deserve. And we, the actors, the performers, we were never in the war. But what are we doing? We are giving ourselves as a vessel for the Africans who died in vain and to speak through us because they continue to live in our DNA.
You know, the stories that come from World War I as well as World War II, as Africans, it's kind of stories that you've heard through the family. I mean, I had a grandfather that was in World War II, and there were those stories that you heard between World War I and World War II about how these soldiers or people who served in these wars weren't even paid. They, you know, you get a bicycle or you get a jacket, a coat, I think was the one in the World War I that I've heard.
Yeah.
And would that have formed a large part of the stories that you workshopped in preparation of putting this piece together?
Definitely, sure. I mean, looking at the statistics of the people who died in the First World War, the recorded people are the Europeans. But what we know, that for every soldier, there were 3 carriers. For every machine gun, there were 7 carriers. For every cannon, there were 21 carriers. And sometimes when the soldier dies in the war, he dies with his carriers. So when you look at the numbers of people who died in the First World War, are black people. And secondly, talking about the jacket and the bicycle, all the European soldiers who fought in the war, they have recognition, and they were given, you know, packages that would set them up for lifetime, including their children and their grandchildren. And the black soldiers and the black carriers in South Africa, we know some died in the SS Mendi, as in the English Channel.
Of course, yes.
And some, those who came back, were given bicycles and the coats. And the coat story is a very, very important symbol of status even today in South Africa, that uma uyolobola inkosazana ukhipha inkomo zakho iphelele, after you've given inkomo ziphelele, you give each a coat to a father. And a coat, there's always an exchange of coat as a symbol of status. Why the coat? Because this coat was made a symbol of status by the men who fought in this war, just wearing these coats, but they died. And these coats were replicated and made, and they couldn't afford them. The only way you could afford it is to say, put it in the list. So, you know, these cultural references that those things that we feel that they are our culture, and we're challenging our own culture to say, what is our culture? What is a colonial response as well?
And what did we do to process the pain that came with that participation? Because you're dealing here with trauma. The trauma of taking part in what would at that time have been a really violent war, because it was rudimentary. and then the trauma of those who survived, who came home, and all the promises that were made to them for various reasons, both those from the southern part of Africa and other parts of Africa as well, those promises were never delivered on as well.
That's trauma. Lives today. If you have a traumatized grandfather, that gives you a traumatized father and traumatized aunts, because these are the children who are raised by a traumatized man. And then we become the traumatized children because this trauma, is passed down from generation to generation. And sometimes it reaches the point where you don't even know what are you traumatized about. It is you just feeling a sense of anxiety, unsettling. You don't know what is anger. You don't know where does it come from. And an opportunity like Head and the Load for performers and for the audience who experience it, it becomes this cathartic process of us sitting down and reflecting and processing these things that are deeply embedded in us, in our bodies.
So let's talk about the production now. You've
Yes.
got this heavy load
Yes.
to deal with and bring to a stage in a theatre performance. You were very involved in the workshopping of it, and I've heard William Kentridge speak before about how important his co-collaborators are. How did that work? How did that process happen? How did it all come together? And I'm sure at the time it would have been cathartic for all of you taking part in it as well.
It was a typical Kentridge process, which he calls the less good idea approach, where there is an idea, and there are artists, there are collaborators. I mean, we have Philip Miller, who composed the music with Ututuga Spisi. We have Gregory Makoma, who is the choreographer of the work. But over and above that, we have Sabine, who's creating the beautiful set. We have Greta Goris creating the beautiful costumes. But at the same time, the performers, what Kentridge does, it gives the performer an opportunity to have a voice in the work. So you become a collaborator in a way that when Gregory is giving you this movement, you give it your personal a narrative as well. So that the process is rich in somatic memory as well.
So tell us what people can expect, because I do believe it's a very specific theatre setup so that the audience feels as if they're almost part of the production. What can people expect from this? Because Kentridge's work and the people that he works with, like you, you're known to put on some stuff that can be seen as quite fantastical in a theatre sense.
Yes, because it was first made when the First World War was being commemorated in London for 100 years of the First World War, and one of the theaters or the co-producers, it was the Mass Smoker in Massachusetts in New York, and the invitation was for Kentridge to create a large-scale production on a 50-meter stage.
Oh, okay.
And it was supposed to be a procession in response to the triumphs and laments that he did in Rome. That what if people are watching a procession for an hour, what else happens, because you get tired? And then he had to think of other elements that he can bring. That's when he brought the story of the First World War. And so in a normal Joburg Theatre sitting, it's not going to work on stage. So what we are doing, what the Head and Load is doing at the Joburg Theatre, we're performing it backstage. So we've turned the theatre around, the audience, and because there we find the length that the Head and the Load requires, and then we created new seating behind the theatre. Wow. So that because when you're sitting in the normal auditorium, it's narrow, so it won't fit. But if you backstage, it's wider because the stage moves side to side beyond the stage. So we're using all those sides, and so that we can place our stage at the back and the audience just watch it from there.
And talk to me about the role of music in telling this story.
The role of music in telling the story is a typical South African thing, because the music is not just an accompaniment, but it is a lived experience. And Philip Miller, in his brilliance, what he did not then just create an orchestra that plays and the dancers that dance or actors that act and the text that happens. But the music is an organic element that works in the piece. So the speech from the actors is linked to the sound. The choreography, even the orchestra is not sitting in the pit. The orchestra is actually organic and it's moving around the stage. And the instruments are transformed into the canons, the instruments. So when you're playing a tuba, in your consciousness is that the tuba is a load. It's either the boat that has been ripped, dismantled, and people are carrying it on the load, and they're moving from Cape Town to the Lake Tanganyika, and which is the the true story, and it's about transformation, and it's about experiencing the work in a new way every day.
We are running out of time, but I wanted to ask you how you are expecting to feel when this is performed in Joburg for the very first time next Friday.
It's nerve-wracking to perform it in Joburg because we have been finding comfort to say we are speaking to Europe. We are speaking to Europe. This is Africa speaking back to Europe. And it's almost like this time around, we're bringing a report. We're bringing a report to Africa to say, when I went drove, Your Majesty, we are telling your story. And this is how we are telling it. And we'll continue telling it.
And I do believe some award-winning news coming through for the performance. Is the performance of Hidden the Load? You've just found out you've won one of the biggest awards you can get in the UK theatre.
Oh my goodness, it's the Waiting for the Sybil, the work that Kyle Shepard and I composed. It is not the Head and the Load.
Okay.
We just want the...
But also work that you've done with William Kentridge.
Of course, William Kentridge is the director of Waiting for the Sybil. I am the associate director and the composer. And we just won the Oliver Award for the performance that we did at the Barbican Theatre in London. Okay,
we're going to leave it there. I think you've given us all enough reason to go to Joburg Theatre to see this. I think it's going to be quite a historical theatre experience. Thank you so much.
Your life.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming in. That is Nhlanhla Mahlangu in studio for us, part of the massively artistic collaboration team, along with William Kentridge, bringing you The Head and the Load to Joburg Theatre, a play on the Ghanaian proverb, the head and the load are the troubles of the neck. Goosebumps, just goosebumps. I don't know, I'm going to be a mess next Friday if I make it to the theatre. Thank you so much for coming in this evening.